Hi, everyone. Welcome to Beyond Metrics, using maturity models to build a doc strategy. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Rodlund. I'm a senior technical writer based in Oakland, California. I work on the developer advocacy team at the Wikimedia Foundation, the nonprofit organization that hosts Wikipedia and a number of other projects centered around free knowledge. My academic background is in creative writing, poetry, believe it or not, and organizational communication, a field centered on how information flows within organizations. This is why I like to think a lot not only about the quality of tech docs and their value to our audiences, but also about how tech docs and tech writers are positioned in their organizations. Today, I'm going to share some practical information about tools you can use to support your tech doc strategy. Whether you're a technical writer or play some other role, I hope this will be of use to you. Today, I'll be referring to concepts in the context of technical documentation, but you should be able to apply them to a variety of processes or strategies beyond the docs. So today we're going to talk about traditional metrics that help us measure the impact of our work and demonstrate its value, when those metrics work and when they don't. I'll provide an overview of maturity models as a complement to traditional metrics and talk about how to use them to gain a high-level view of your goals and your doc strategy. Finally, I'll show a couple of maturity models from the Wikimedia Foundation and share some ideas for creating your own. So a few years ago, the technical team at Wikimedia had no tech doc strategy and no owner for it. When I came on as a tech writer, I heard over and over again, the docs are bad, the docs need help. There are tickets in our task management system that literally say, the docs suck. But when I tried to drill down and learn what this meant or what people expected from the docs, I couldn't get a clear articulation about why people felt this way. People who cared about technical documentation at Wikimedia were in the middle of a dark forest without a map or a compass. There were no other technical writers on staff at the time, and as an organization, we had no understanding of who owned documentation, or the breadth or quality of our assets, or the state of our collections. The documentation was written by staff and volunteer developers from all over the world who often did not communicate with each other. And though there had been a few attempts at getting a handle on technical documentation, they were short-lived. Most efforts were piecemeal and not focused around a larger strategy based on quality. So how do we get a handle on this? The technology behind Wikipedia and its sister projects is supported by a huge community of staff and volunteer developers. There are many complicated relationships between people and the projects, and there are strict limits about the type of data we can collect or keep. So when we started our journey to get a handle on our tech docs, we couldn't lean too hard on traditional metrics to help us create a picture of the state of our docs. To be honest, even if we had all the resources in the world, our tech docs organization was so immature, we might not have known how to apply those resources effectively. So at this point, I started to think about different tools we could use just to get oriented and set us in a direction. We couldn't collect a lot of metrics and didn't have the resources to know where to apply them or how to analyze them. I decided to build a maturity model for our tech docs. A maturity model is a flexible framework that helps people understand where an organization or project is at any given time. It allows you to see where you've been, where you are, and where you're headed. Our model helped us define a starting point, made it possible for us to set some achievable goals, and also to start moving out of that dark forest that we were in. It also gave us a common language to talk with others in a more organized way about creating tech doc strategy, and also allowed us to demonstrate our progress to them. So before we dive too deeply into the basics of maturity models, I'd like to take a look at traditional metrics. When I think of metrics, my mind naturally turns to numbers or methods by which we can collect quantitative data. In my experience, tech docs resist quantification. They don't produce flashy numbers. So traditional metrics, at least for this purpose, can consist of a range of methods to measure the impact and success of your tech doc strategy. We're going to take a look at three categories of metrics. We'll start with quality at the top, move down through performance and quantity, kind of going with the theme that the value of metrics is tied less to quantification when it comes to docs. So quality is really at the top of the kinds of metrics that you can collect, and then quantity is really at the bottom for what's going to be useful to you. So if we look at quality, we can look at some examples like readability scores. These typically apply to individual documents or collections that readers see, and they can give you a little bit of information about the quality of your docs, but they don't provide insight on the process or decisions behind how you made them, and they don't provide a high-level view. Another thing that you can look at is the timeliness and accuracy of your docs. This is really key to quality, and you can measure how many docs in your collection are up to date or not. Another thing to look at is, are your docs consistent? Is the style repeatable? Again, if you have a consistent style guidelines or content guidelines, you can measure how many docs in your collection are actually meeting those deadlines. You can set quality goals and you can measure fairly easily whether you have met them or not. But how do you know what you met? How do you measure whether your quality requirements are successful? I think this is less tangible. You can learn some things about your docs through gathering performance metrics as well. So page views can provide some valuable information. On our projects at Wikimedia, we have definitely used page views to some success to help us prioritize the order in which we do updates to pages in a collection. But we don't necessarily draw conclusions about why our users are visiting based on this data. All we're really learning is that people visited pages more or less frequently. You can use helpfulness ratings, so likes and shares, and those can be really useful to get you a little closer to what's going on in your reader's mind. They also fall short in some ways. Like, why does a reader like a page? What encouraged them to give you a certain score? And how do you use that to drive your doc strategy? You can also use satisfaction surveys. They can tell you so much. You want to make sure that they're conducted frequently enough that the information is useful to you and timely. And then you want to make sure of things like your respondents don't confuse the quality of your documentation with the quality of the processes they're documenting. And you have to ask the right questions. So in my experience, sometimes when we do a satisfaction survey of our readers, we find that it leaves us with even more questions. So you can also look at quantity, which would be kind of the number of words written and the number of docs created. We can pretty universally agree that an increased amount of documentation can make an impression when we're trying to prove our value to others, but more documentation does not necessarily equal better documentation. So quantity goal may not reflect the true state of your docs. It can be difficult to meet, and if you encounter any sort of situation that needs more research or you have a blocker from outside that you can't control. So traditional metrics can provide us with a lot of information, but it can be really difficult to define the direction of your tech doc strategy or demonstrate the impact of your work if you're relying on those alone. Traditional metrics can help us, but they can also fall short. So we'll just think about that for a little bit. Basically, depending on your resources, you may be able to collect a lot of data using traditional metrics, but how do you interpret and act on them? We can report that we created more docs, or we can get higher page views, but do these numbers accurately reflect the quality of the docs strategy, the quality of our docs, or the success of our strategy? You can never be free of metrics, nor am I arguing that you should be, but we want to be able to provide ourselves with additional lenses and frameworks to get a better view. So really, let's be clear. I'm not arguing for the abandonment of traditional metrics. I think that these are valuable tools that we can use to improve the quality of our work and create better experiences for our readers. But we can expand our view and build even better experiences by expanding our toolkit. If you have a high-level view of where you are and where you want to be with your tech doc strategy, you're in a way better position to know which metrics will be useful to you at any given time and to be able to interpret and apply those learnings that you gather from your metrics. If you're looking for a way to get oriented with your tech doc strategy, set goals, success criteria, and benchmarks, contextualize metrics, and tangibly show the progress, success, or failure of your work, you may want to create a maturity model like we did. In this section, we're going to take a look at maturity models, what they are, and how you might use them to expand and enrich your technical documentation strategy. Before we dive in, I want to say that this is a very basic introduction to a very big topic. Maturity models are used across a wide range of industries to help frame processes and strategy. Some maturity models are more complex than others and contain more elements than I'll be able to explore today. But if you're curious and you want to know more after the talk, I've started to collect a list of resources, and I'll have a link to that at the end of the talk. So first we'll go into a little history. There have always been systems ways of thinking about the maturity of processes and strategies, and I don't think maturity models came into being just because they were given a formal name, but they were. In the 70s and 80s, there's a lot of work and research done in this area. And with the support of the US Department of Defense, the Software Engineering Institute developed what is called the Capability Maturity Model, which is kind of the basis for a lot of the maturity models that we look at today. This was used to help document and optimize software engineering and development processes. People soon realized that maturity models could be adapted and used to help improve the development of their own organizations and processes, including the management of documentation projects. So what is a maturity model? A maturity model illustrates the levels of continuous improvement within an organization or project. Each level represents a different stage of maturity and provides a snapshot of the project or organization at that time. The goal is to progress through each level of maturity by focusing the direction of your strategy and efforts on the behaviors, practices, and processes outlined in each level through evaluation, goal setting, and strategic intention. So as an example, we'll explore one iteration of the maturity model developed by Joanne T. Hackos in the mid-90s. This is focused on information processes and documentation, and it's the version that we use as the basis of our own model for documentation at Wikimedia. When you start to explore maturity models, you'll see that each level may have a different name depending on the document, but maturity models are typically move from ad hoc or chaotic levels through strategic levels up to optimizing levels. In the next slide, I'll frame these levels specifically in the language that we use for our own maturity model for documentation at Wikimedia. So for each of these levels, I'll speak to those aspects in our organization. And as you can see here in front of you are the 5 levels, typically 5 levels of maturity in a maturity model. So if you start at the ad hoc phase, this is more chaotic. Everyone agrees that somebody should do something about documentation, but no one is responsible for establishing or guiding a process. Documentation is created on the spot or as an afterthought rather than as a priority or a part of the development cycle. There are no style standards or processes around documentation creation, review, or publication. This is something that, this is where we started at our organization. This is our dark forest. The next step is rudimentary. Technical documentation content collections exist, but may have limited and inconsistent coverage of topics. There's no method for prioritizing more relevant or needed information within a content collection. There may be a style guide available, but it's not widely used. Some processes are established but not followed consistently. And then community conversations about technical documentation may not be healthy or productive. The next stage, which is baseline, which I think is a perfectly good place to be, is an organized and repeatable stage. So this is when you're starting to get healthier and more mature. Processes and tools are well documented, and individual contributors can follow these processes and use these tools with minimal onboarding. When and where technical documentation can be automated, it is. There's a style guide which defines agreed upon standards for quality, and it is used to guide the creation of new documentation. There's a system in place to ensure documentation is periodically reviewed for accuracy. The next stage, which is more aspirational, is managed and sustainable. This is at this stage, there's a comprehensive strategy for improving quality and growing sustainable technical documentation content. There are specialized subject matter experts working together to implement the aspects of this strategy. And there's an effort to begin benchmarking quality of technical documentation and user experience against similar organizations. The processes for surfacing technical documentation needs and calls for improvement are well established and a part of a culture, whatever culture of technical documentation you have in your community. Content collections are well established and organized, and it's easy to find information across and within collections. Technical documentation and communication are focused around user needs. Documentation is high quality, it's clear, it's concise and up to date. And then the documentation is peer reviewed and also reviewed for accuracy from time to time. The next level is optimizing or superior. In our maturity model, this is kind of a little bit of a blank slate. What I look at it is more an innovative level. You're at a state where other organizations are looking to you to show them the way in terms of the kind of documentation you're using. And then you're creating, and then you're also in full alignment with whatever the strategic direction of your organization is. So this is a place to really strive for. It's a very aspirational place to be. So, what form do maturity models take? They take all sorts of forms. They can exist as images, written text, formal or loose frameworks, scratched out on the back of a napkin. Their creation can be a formal exercise by your team or something more casual you do on your own to gain your bearings. Um, I'll show you a couple visual models that I found that I thought were really nice to look at. Um, and then I'll show you later in the presentation some of the maturity models from our organization. And we'll take a closer look at those at the end of the talk. As I mentioned before in an earlier slide, um, what's important to remember is that maturity models just all share a similar trait. They move from this ad hoc initial chaotic phase through a strategic phase and then into an optimizing phase. So the first model that we're looking at is one that was created for information governance. This is a very typical maturity model, has 5 levels from initial to optimized. It's in a pyramid shape to show like what, I almost think like Maslow's pyramid where you have the base needs and then you go towards the top, towards optimizing. And in each, you can see there's a description of the maturity levels for the organization. The next one that we'll look at is this content maturity model for content strategy. I can't say for sure, but I'm pretty sure that it's based on the information process model that was created by Joanne Hakos. This one is a little bit more complicated than the model that we looked at before. It has what we call key process areas. So you'll see that in the first column, that there are more than one aspect of maturity that it's measuring. And so maturity might look different and be in different places for these key process areas. And I can show you that a little bit more when we look at one of the maturity models for Wikimedia. And then next, again, we have another colorful infographic. This one covers software testing. Again, you see these 5 levels moving from initial to optimizing. And so this is another visual maturity model. And so what I want to say, even though I've shared these as examples, is that they can be visual, but they don't have to be. And in fact, our model for Tech Docs is not visual at this point, and I'll show you that in a few moments. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what they're good for. Maturity models creating a maturity model can be a great exercise to help you get started. It gets you thinking critically about the state of your docs, and it helps you figure out where you are. Working on a maturity model can help you and your team create an honest picture of the state of your tech docs and create a values-based strategic process. While you're building the model, you can give yourself permission to put numbers aside and discuss the best practices you should be following to achieve your goals. Once you have defined the levels of maturity for your organization or project, you can start goal setting. you can better see the gaps that you have and turn them into areas for focus and improvement. You should keep returning to the model periodically to see if your efforts have been successful and to determine where they have fallen short. Over time, you can use this exercise to guide your tech doc strategy, including understanding better when and where to use traditional metrics. So, a maturity model can also give your team and others a clear and common language about documentation and the direction you're going in. The document can be a powerful touch point for you and your team and others in your organization. And it's also good for when you want to tangibly demonstrate change, growth, success, or the failings of your strategy or project to yourself and others. With a maturity model, you can show the state of your docs over time. So, maturity models are great tools, but they are not a perfect tool. Just like any tool that you use to work with strategy, they do have shortfalls. If you let them, maturity models can be too fluid or too rigid to use. Their stability and reliability all depend on your influence to see them for what they are. There's really no science to this except that you and your team need to be clear-eyed about the current needs of your project or organization, and you need to be ready to pivot or redefine what maturity means in your context. But again, don't rewrite the model every time there's a new factor that comes into play. Having a set of diverse contributors to the model can really help with this. Another problem with the model, especially the visual versions of it, is that it can dupe you into thinking that progression has to be linear. The truth is that some aspects of your model will mature faster than others. Some will stall, some will already feel in a mature state when you begin. Um, I've read advice that you shouldn't move into the next level without meeting the criteria for the ones below them. And I just disagree with this. Progress can be dependent on many factors, including the higher strategic goals of the org or the resources that you have available to you or you don't have available to you. Instead of having a rigid view of progress, I advise you to celebrate your wins and focus on your gaps as areas of improvement. So, speaking of goals, maturity models are never complete. You will always be iterating and improving based on an internal and external factors. That's why I say, like, oh, this level is aspirational. If you're looking for firm deadlines and definitive measurements, or if you need things neatly tied up in a bow, this should not be your sole evaluation system. Use it as a guide alongside your other evaluation tools, including traditional metrics. Maturity models can be limited by a lack of diverse perspectives. So, whenever possible, you should bring others in to help you define maturity for your project or your organization. Don't cling to your personal idea of maturity. Other people can really help you. This is important to your project and to others. So, how do we use maturity models at the Wikimedia Foundation? And what we're looking at here in this slide is our technical documentation organization maturity model. As you can see, our maturity model for tech docs is completely text-based. This is intentional as I really wanted to avoid the feeling that progress needs to be linear, that I think that some visual models can give you. When we started, I really wanted to focus on definitions and descriptions because we were just starting with nothing and I didn't want to put any more stress on the system. We have one model to measure the maturity of our tech docs organization, which is the one in front of you. And then we have one model to measure the maturity and quality of processes um, around our software, uh, around the quality processes around the tech docs. Sorry, excuse me about that. Some models might call these key process areas. Again, I didn't want to put words on those. I want to keep things very deconstructed for this initial model just to get us started. So you can think of ours as kind of a formal, informal model. We have two tech writers at the foundation, and we meet periodically throughout the year, usually around planning cycles, quarterly. We meet biweekly just to kind of discuss what's going on with docs. And at those times, sometimes we'll look at the maturity model. And then we look at it more formally at quarterly cycles and at yearly cycles. We ask questions like, where were we? Where are we? Where do we need to go? We look at the initiatives and projects we're working on and ask, did these help us move in X direction? And we discuss initiatives and projects that we think will best meet the gaps and help us plan our work in the future. Our organization started at ad hoc. I would say we're firmly in the rudimentary phase now. You could say the progress is slow, but I think that it's leaps and bounds from where we were. And it's just really great to have this document to be able to say to ourselves, oh, yeah, this is how we progressed, but also be able to easily demonstrate that within our organization with others who ask, what have you been doing? So after a couple of years of working this model, we've really realized that maturity in our organization probably looks different than it does in comparative organizations. So since we have a perspective and common language and a few years working with it, or a couple of years working with it, we'll come back to this model again and probably rebuild it sometime this year. So the next model that we're looking at from Wikimedia is this architecture maturity model. Our architecture team, their model looks completely different from ours. And it also looks different from the visual models that I showed you earlier. The foundation is the same. There are these 5 levels of maturity, going from least to most mature. But you also notice there are key process areas here. So this model is just more complicated. Each of the key process areas has its own gauge of maturity. And if you look at the dashboard, you can see each progressing at a different level at a different time. Yay for nonlinearity. That's my new favorite word. So as you can see, these models that I've shown you are really flexible. They take different forms. Again, I keep kind of hitting this point. You'll be able to recognize it when you see the movement from ad hoc to strategic to optimizing. The key is just to adapt it to your organization or your project or whatever you're planning on doing. So finally, I just want to give you some tips to get you started working on a maturity model of your own. The first thing to think about is explore other models. This is a wide subject, and there are just zillions of examples available for you to look at. By looking at others, you can get an idea of how to build your own and really just like what you want to do with it. Start with your goals, where you'd like to see your tech docs or your org, and work back through the levels from the highest level to the lowest level of maturity. It may be helpful to spend time looking at the output of other organizations. Are there collection of tech docs that you admire and you want yours to be on the same level? Ask yourself what elements you would need to be in place in your organization to get to a similar place of maturity, and then work back from there. Adjust your expectations. So whatever organization or what's available for you to use, you're going to really have to adjust your expectations. You can look to others, but it needs to be what works for your org. So like I said, after reviewing our maturity model this year, we realized we probably need to readjust how we view maturity in the context of our organizations. There are things we excel at. There are things we do not excel at. There are things that we will likely be able to do. And then we just have certain constraints that other organizations don't have. This doesn't mean we should be kept from becoming a more mature organization. It just means we have to decide what maturity looks like for us and then strive for that. If you're going to formalize this practice in your organization, I cannot stress enough to bring in diverse perspectives at each level of the process in building the framework so that you get a clearer, more fulsome view. This is best practice for anything having to do with strategic process in an organization. Decide on a cadence for revisiting. This may fall naturally in line with the planning processes for your organization, or it may have something to do with just a quarterly or yearly goal that you've created as a touch point. And then how large a role your maturity model plays in the process of building your strategic direction is really up to you. It might be very informal. It might just be something that you're looking at, but it might be something that's really integrated into your strategic process. And then finally, in my experience, maturity models are about progress, not perfection. They exist to orient you and guide you toward your goals. Don't get too caught up in going exactly from point A to point B or meeting a specific metric. Instead, use your maturity model to get oriented and to give you a sense of direction you need to feel confident about your doc strategy. And that is it for maturity models. Thank you so much for listening to my talk. I hope that you found something useful here for the creation of your TAC doc strategy or whatever project you're working on. If you like my talk, feel free, or have questions, feel free to contact me on Twitter. And I'm also compiling a set of resources and readings about maturity models, including the slides for this talk, and you can find those on GitHub at this link. Thank you so much.
Hi, Sarah, what an incredible talk. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
It is always a hot topic. People kind of put their documentation into the ether, I think, and then they kind of go, what next? And I thought this was a really cool way of quantifying what success actually looks like. I don't know if you saw in the chat, but I think you inspired a DocOps unconference session. So really, really great response to all your ideas and everything that you shared. I think that's great.
Yeah, awesome. I did see that. That was really cool.
Yeah. So we've got some questions. The first one is from another Sarah. And she says, I'm very interested in hearing more about how you measure things like whether a doc follows guidelines. I work at an organization with a lot of guidelines and resources about how to write good docs, which is great, but not much process around checking the doc that gets produced. And as a follow-up comment, she said, for context, it's an overall doc set of like 100,000 web pages.
Yeah, that's a lot. And yeah, I mean, we've had some discussions about this as well, because we've asked ourselves, is it possible to automate like ways to look at documents and see if they're following specific guidelines? I would say that it's actually just really difficult. I don't have like one solution for that. Yeah, it's really difficult, especially when it's like such a huge set of documents, I think, to look at. What you can do is set your standards, and then just really check to see if your documents are following them. But it is kind of hard.
No, for sure. Question from Swapnil is, do you get back to users or readers if and when you've made changes based on their feedback?
We do. We try to. We're an open source organization. A large number of our contributors are volunteers. We've been trying to build a community around technical documentation with our volunteers as well. And so it's really important for us to do outreach with them and talk to them about changes that they've made to docs, or if they have questions for us, or if they want us to make changes. We try to work with them and get back to them.
No, that's great. Alex had a question. He asks, has there been a study or database, I think DB, to determine what common values docs get from rating systems to determine an industry standard? He seemed very enthusiastic about this idea.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea, and I'm not aware of one. I'd probably have to do a little bit more research on that.
No, for sure. And when you're talking about flexibility, I think that'd be a really hard thing to pin down.
It is kind of hard to pin down, and I think that's the thing. That's the thing about this, is it's like maturity model gives you a framework. But the framework is kind of decided by you. So you're saying this is what our organization or our project looks like at our level of maturity. And what you can do comparative analysis with other organizations, and you can say, okay, these are ideal attributes that this other organization has, or this other set of docs has that we want to have. It really has to fit your organization. It's interesting because I was thinking about Daniele's talk from earlier today in light of this, and that idea of kind of the like organic progression of documentation. And in a lot of ways, I think that this fits into that as well, because you really have to readjust from time to time to figure out if this is the right kind of maturity for your organization or for your doc strategy.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how the talks kind of play against each other. And definitely, I was thinking about your talk in the context of agile, where the goalposts might always be moving, right? So I
Right.
was
Yeah.
really, yeah. Erin had more of a technical question. What plugins, if any, do you use to help with gathering documentation metrics?
Again, at our organization, we don't really have that. And part of that, there are some things that we can do with our templates, but everything that we do is built on MediaWiki, which is the software that's used also for, it's a lot of people use it for their wikis. It's used for Wikipedia, and it's just open source software. So there are some plugins available, but not necessarily ones that we can use to measure our docs.
Right.
And so this is actually kind of a question that we've been asking a lot lately too. Again, going back to like the how do you measure this or that, it's just so hard sometimes in this context because of the tools that are available to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cynthia asks an interesting question. Sarah, is your two-person team responsible for all technical documentation at Wikimedia, or do other people, like developers, etc., also contribute? If other people contribute, how do you encourage them to follow processes and move up the maturity model?
Sure. So this is a great question. There are 2 technical writers on staff. That doesn't mean that we produce all the technical documentation. A lot of the developers on staff also work on technical documentation, and they consult with us. And then again, our vast network of volunteers is always working on it and contributing to it too. And we've been working very hard in the last couple of years to build a community around documentation. And I kind of want to plug this talk from a couple of years ago at Write the Docs. It was called Friends of the Docs, or something like that. I can't remember. If I can find the link, maybe you can share it later.
Yeah,
but
of course.
it really talked, like, it was very inspiring for us, and talked a lot about building communities around technical documentation so that technical writers aren't the only people working on that within an organization. And we've really tried to run with that in our organization, because if we didn't, then we wouldn't be able to have the coverage that we have. And we still need so much coverage for our technical documentation.
Right. And I don't know if you see in the chat, Eric has been super quick on the draw, and
Oh,
he's gotten
awesome.
a link. So
this is a great talk. This is an awesome talk, and I would recommend anybody who's looking to build community around documentation to watch that talk.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for the tip. And lastly, Brooke says that she'd love to see some recommended maturity models that'd be good to look at for inspiration or recommendations for someone looking to build one. So I think you cover that great in your slides, and I think we'd all love to see them.
Yeah, I also have I'll put it in the link. I have a GitHub repository that I'm working on right now that has some resources in it as well. And I can put some links to different maturity models in there. I'm just kind of slowly building it up over time. So,
yeah. Well, that is so cool. Thank you so much, Sarah. This was such a great talk. I know it really piqued people's curiosity, and I'm hoping that we'll all have new ways to come back to our own docs, or whatever anybody here is working on, and try to look at it in a different light. And I think that's so cool.
Awesome. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk at Write the Docs. It was great. And yeah, thank you.
So great having you, Sarah. Thank you so much. Have a good one.
Bye.